Hello, my friends, wherever you find yourself in time and space. My name is Morten. I run the show called Making Sense of, and today I've invited Miriam on the show to talk about CSS, specifically CSS layers. There's been a lot of forward momentum in CSS in the past several years, and there are new features coming online constantly. So I figured I'd go straight to the source to find out about some new features. So Miriam, can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi. Good to be here. I'm Miriam Suzanne, and for the last couple of years, I've been lucky enough to work on the CSS Working Group with a lot of other great people. And I also run OddBird, a small agency, um, with some great developers there doing client work. So mix of things, but it's a lot of fun getting to work on new features in CSS.
Can you briefly explain what the CSS Working Group is and how it relates to the web as a whole?
Yeah, so the CSS Working Group is one of the working groups at the World Wide Web Consortium, the W3C. And each group has its own remit, the things that it works on. We work on CSS. I'm not actually sure how large the group is. It's large enough that I don't recognize or know everybody. Then again, I joined right when COVID started, so I've never met a lot of them in person,
Ah, yes.
where that would be a thing that usually happens and it hasn't. But it's a fairly large group um, and meets every week, and great conversations, lots of people coming from different perspectives, bringing different expertise to it. Combination of engineers from the browser vendors and a few of us that have been working in the field and are sort of invited as just experts in CSS, and other representatives of other organizations that have a stake in the web and in CSS. So companies like Adobe, even though they're not making a browser, are invested in design on the web. So they're part of the group. Yeah,
And the purpose of the CSS Working Group is a vague name, but basically when CSS is rolled out to the browsers, it comes from the CSS Working Group, correct?
yeah, we decide what makes it into a specification and write those specifications, and then the browsers are theoretically supposed to implement what we said.
Yes.
And they're involved in that process. They're part of the group, so they have a lot of say in that as well. A lot of say. I mean, things generally won't make it into a spec if the browsers say they're not willing to do it.
Yeah,
because
that
what's
makes
the
sense.
point of writing a spec that's not going to happen?
Yeah, so when you go to the W3C website and you read these very technical specs,
Yeah,
that are very like extremely detailed and defined and written in a very academic way, that's what you're talking about, is writing this specification that is then directed to the browsers to be implemented.
exactly. And the goal is to make sure that we're covering all the bases so that every implementation works the same way, and not only works correctly the same way, but fails in the same ways. We need to make it, because if one browser fails in a different way than another, people will start to rely on that bug in, say, Chrome, and then they'll get mad at Safari for failing differently, and not being reliable. So they'll get used to it one way, and then they'll get mad at somebody else for doing it the other way. So we have to make sure that we're thinking through how's it gonna fail, how's it gonna break down, how are people gonna use it wrong, and can we make sure that it works wrong the same way also?
Yay, web standards. This is such a good description of what web development on the front end is. It's like, how do you do something wrong and then hope it fails in the way you intended?
Yeah, and it
Basically,
was a problem with like the early drafts of CSS specifications. They didn't describe that in detail, and so you ended up with a lot of variety, sort of, when things got into edge cases. And we don't want there to be a lot of difference in the implementations.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, as part of this, you've been involved in some fairly big things. Oh, help me out. What was the thing that used to be called element queries, content queries?
Yeah, container queries.
Container queries, thank you. There's been so many different names for it. So
Yeah.
that showed up last year, and you did a ton
We have a
of.
prototype of that, and I expect it to start rolling out in browsers later this year,
Very exciting.
publicly. Yeah.
And so now you're like, now that browsers are considering possibly rolling it out, I'm on to the next thing, which is layers.
Yeah. And layers have rolled out. So layers are actually ahead of container queries in their rollout. They're now supported in all of the major modern browsers.
Okay, so let's talk about this, because this is, to me, very interesting. And I tweeted about it, and then you immediately corrected me, which I love. I'm like, I like nothing more than to say something publicly, and then someone be like, because I do that all the time, and I'm an educator. So if I say something that isn't precise, someone needs to correct me, because otherwise people are like, yes, that is absolutely the truth. So I said that layers are, I don't remember. I said that layers are a way of scoping the cascade. And you're like, no, no, no. Layers are, there's two layers to this. There's like layers and then there's scope, and they are different.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's sort of like what you said isn't necessarily wrong, or it's just that because there's two things, I'm super careful about using the name of one of them in talking about the other one. Because, yeah, so cascade layers help with sort of solving what overrides what wins in a conflict. So the whole cascade is about that problem. It's like there's multiple ways to style a button. You can do inline styles, you can do attached styles, you can do different types of selectors, element selectors, or class selectors, or IDs. And there's more. The browser can provide styles, and we can provide styles, and users can provide styles. So there's all these styles coming from everywhere, and we need to pick one background color out of all those styles for the button. It can't have multiple background colors. We got to pick one. So that's what the cascade is. It's a set of steps, an algorithm to determine a winner. And the cascade, for a long time, all the control that we've had is specificity. More specific selectors win. And that's a good guess at what we want, right? When we're grabbing a bunch of things and styling them, that's usually a default. And when we're grabbing one thing and styling it, that's usually, we want that to override the default. So specificity is this good guess. But we thought it would be nice to have something more explicit than that. So cascade layers let you just say, this selector, even though it's low specificity, I want it to always win. And this one, even though it's high specificity, I want it to always lose. So you can start just stacking your styles however you want them to override each other. So I think it's, Harry Roberts has the inverted triangle approach to writing CSS, where he talks about different layers. And it's very much designed around that same idea that we can have sort of a defaults layer, and then on top of that, maybe a theme, and on top of that, maybe a design system. I don't know. Those things are all near the bottom. They're broad. And then we get like a component library that's a little more specific than that. And then we've got overrides at the top.
So this becomes useful anytime you're working with, say, components.
Yeah.
Because you can then give the components their own layer and control their where in the cascade the component inserts itself. Because anyone who's worked with components where you have these self-styling units that drop into a thing that already has a bunch of styles, and then there's a war between who has control over that. And sometimes things get overridden in a way that you didn't intend to, and things just get weird, and you do a lot of debugging. So I'm assuming that that's where this need came from. Or is it just a guess on my part?
Well, I would say, so there's two ways of thinking about that. So I would say this is going to help more with saying, that the component library, components generally should win over the default design system or something like that. I don't think it's going to be as useful for saying in which individual components override which other individual components. And that's where scope is probably going to be more helpful. You could use this that way. If you're really clear that a certain component, when it's used, should always win over the other components, you could do that. You could bump it into a higher layer. But if you're nesting components and you sort of want the innermost one to win, that's where scope helps. Scope helps say, here's the scope of this component, and don't touch anything outside of it. And in fact, let things inside of it win over it. Don't style things inside of it. You can sort of cut holes out of a component and say that gets styled from somewhere else. It doesn't get styled by this component.
Right, and this is a significant distinction because, as we know, when features get rolled out in CSS, they get used in interesting ways, and then someone writes a blog post, and then that blog post becomes like the blog post everyone goes to, and it becomes the standard.
And 10 years later,
I can see how like clarifying these two things becomes very important early on. Because both of these are features that I think a lot of people have been wanting. Like, people want more control over the cascade, and you get as far as like BEM, where you go like throw out the cascade completely, literally specify styles on an individual level, and then you have build processes. I forget the one that LinkedIn built where it would output these, every single class gets a new hash name, so that literally everything on the page has its own custom CSS attached to it. Which, you know, as me, like, I'm one of those web standards purists people who's like, no, you must adhere to this cascade. Anything else is a web standards crime. You know, the web standards black ops are coming to your house to punish you for not following the cascade. And then you have this other way of doing it. And I feel a bit like these things, so the layers, the cascade, and some of the other things that are happening in CSS are sort of trying to respond to this hyper specificity and saying, let's make it possible to do the things you want without breaking the cascade, which is kind of the core of CSS itself.
Yeah, and I would say, you know, there's a sense in which we're solving the problem in the opposite way because we can. So instead of saying, let's get rid of the cascade so that we can make these decisions, we're saying, actually, you should be able to make those decisions as part of the cascade. So, you know, people have been fighting against the cascade, and we're like, let's give you a solution and have it be part of the thing instead of fighting the thing. And I think the funniest response that I've seen is the like, why would I need this? I have 3 build tools that customize every single selector, and I'm like, well, that's why you need. That's exactly. Yes.
Yeah. You know, it's so someone is asking here, is this the kind of layers we're talking about on CSS at layers? So let me just punch up this page here real quick so we can see it. How do I do this again? Share. So I'm so prepared always. Share screen. Yes. And I went to share.
That is it. I know that there were some changes after they posted that initial page, and I'm not sure if they've updated, but we can take a look here.
Yeah, let's see. Oh, cool. I can't share anything because my computer has updated. That's fun. Yes, but it is.
But that is the page.
That is the page. There's also a different page. Let's see. I have a banner for it. There is this one, the CSS Tricks Cascade Layers article that you wrote. That is a very in-depth breakdown of what is going on here with fancy graphics and lots of interesting things.
Yeah, CSS Tricks does these complete guides to a feature. So I wrote one up for this.
Yeah, it's funny how I always end up going to CSS Tricks and to MDN as the 2 sources for pretty much everything that has to do with documentation. And between them, you get absolute overall like tarp level coverage of everything you need. Because you usually have these kind of implementation level things, and then you have the more detailed stuff on MDN. So you say that this is already rolled out across all the browsers. How would you like to see this implemented? Like, I am a web developer. How do I start using this in a way that falls in line with how it's supposed to be used?
Yeah, I would start if you're using something like a reset. Resets are great, but you generally always want to be able to override them without any trouble for specific things. And that's meant that you try to keep resets pretty low specificity, which can be pretty limiting. Sometimes you want to say, no, I would like in my reset for, I don't know, images in this certain context to do a certain thing, right? And you're starting to add a little specificity there. But you still want to be able to override it, or links that are active, something. So right away, I would just take a reset and throw it in a reset layer, and layers stack below the default. So you can start by just taking things that you want to override easily. You can put them in a layer and they get downgraded. So they'll still apply, but then all of your other styles will automatically win, no matter what the specificity is.
Oh,
so
that's
nice. That's where to start. I found, like, right now, the tooling isn't great. Like, it's not obvious to me how to, like, in Vue or React, add a layer while I'm linking a style sheet, right? That's not built into those tools. And it's also not built into HTML yet. Like, ideally, we want the link tag in HTML to be able to have a layer attribute. So you could say, here's a link to my reset, throw it in a reset layer. Right now, you have to do it using that @layer rule. So that means you're doing it inside your style sheets somewhere. Hopefully, also, the frameworks and reset providers will start adding it so that you don't have to. They can start adding layers to the tools, and then that becomes even part of the API. You can take layers from somebody else's. If you're using third-party styles, you can take those layers and you can even sort of rearrange where they fit in your styles. You could put, say, Bootstrap starts providing layers. You could say, okay, I have some things that I want to go under Bootstrap, and I've got some things I want to go over Bootstrap. And you can set up how they stack in yours. I think it's going to be particularly useful for those third-party styles where you don't know where Bootstrap is using an ID or throwing important in there. You just want to take their bundle and pull it in somewhere.
Right, which would be hugely helpful, because everyone who's worked with any of these prototyping frameworks that somehow made their way onto the web proper knows that, sometimes it's very easy to change something, and then sometimes you're like, why isn't it changing? And you go in and you look at the selector, and the selector is like 18 selectors long to this hyper specificity where you have to copy this huge string of like this class plus this class plus this class plus li, ul, li, a, b, and there it is. Only that one button that I absolutely needed to change, and having the ability to just be like, no. I know that that's the default, but I want to override it would simplify CSS a lot.
And it gets to the point of layers, which is that, like, sometimes those selectors are necessary, especially when you're trying to do one size fits all solution that's going to work on every website everywhere. You sometimes have to be very specific about things that you don't actually, they're not actually important in a way. They're just specific. And you need to be able to provide those things. And actually, if you look at browser styles too, they'll do that. There are a number of browser styles that are like 6 nested element selectors. But the cascade provides this thing where anything that authors write overrides anything that the browser wrote in terms of styles. So that's what the cascade's for. It's already doing that layering, and we just added sort of more layering that we could control inside of that.
Formalized layering, I guess.
So I would start with things like resets, things that you're trying to push down in the stack. Once I mean, I think over the long term, most styles will end up layered, because what you might do is say at the beginning, okay, here's our 7 layers. For me, they're usually something like, we've got a reset, we've got some initial styles, sort of like rebuilding the default styles for this project. And then on top of that, we have patterns, which might be like cards or whatever, reusable. You can put different content in them, but the pattern is similar. And then on top of that, we put components, which are like a specific version. Like a calendar card is more specific than a card. So we've got a card pattern, and then we've got a calendar component. And then if you need some overrides over that. So we've got like, okay, here's our 5 or 6 layers that we're going to use for this project. And you can add more internally if you need to, but I think down the road, that's where we end up, is everything ends up in a layer, because we can just set them up at the beginning and fit styles into them.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Like when I structure my styles, especially when I work in like a React application, I always have this, I use CSS modules because that makes sense in my head. And I always have a global import of the CSS reset at the top. And then I have global styles. And I also have a global CSS what do you call it, custom properties file that's just CSS custom properties that sits on top. And then they feed into everything else. And then I have like the application layer, which is the rough layout and the core layout and the core fallbacks for everything. And then I have, page specific things or component specific things or selection specific things. And it ends up in separate files anyway. And then I have to constantly think like, how do I make sure when I build these top layers, I even use the term layers when I do this, how do I make sure that these don't accidentally become hard to override later?
Right.
And it ends up being this, I'm hesitant to apply too much styling to the early global thing, because when I do, I have to override them later, which, because I'm a minimalist designer is okay. But when I work with people who are maximalist designers who really like go full on, it becomes super challenging. And it feels like this is this huge relief once people figure it out, is a huge relief to that kind of work process.
That's the idea. And I think those are perfect examples. And it is sort of like the natural breakdown. And I think we also, sort of as a best practice, we have this sense that you start with the defaults and you move towards the components, right? In terms of like the ordering of your styles. And layers are the same way. It's sort of like you put your lowest priority, broadest layers at the top, and then you get more and more specific with your layers. So you can basically take the structure you already have and just wrap each folder in a layer, and you're good. Done. That's it.
Right. And I haven't tried this, so you need to like guide me through this. So I can say this is the order of the layers.
Yes.
Right. And it's not like, does it follow the cascade order in the document, or do I put numbers on it, or how does that work?
Right. So layers are stacked in the order that they appear. So you can just keep them in order, right? So, and the last ones are going to override the first ones.
Yeah.
But there is also a layer statement rule where you can just sort of list a bunch of names in the order you want them. So that way you can, at the top of your CSS, whatever that is, whether that's in a CSS file or in the head of your document, you can just say @layer and then list in order the layers that you're going to have, because you can add to layers from anywhere. So once you've declared the name of a layer, it's been added to the layer order, and then you can have another layer block with the same name, and it will add styles back up to there, if that makes sense. So
my component can throw content into a higher layer, even though the rest of the layer is defined elsewhere, and then it'll slot in at that level instead of
right. So you can say, here's my layers. I've got a reset. I've got a design system, I've got components. Let's start with those three.
Mhm.
You can just say that at the top. Those are the three, they're in that order. And then you can have your code actually be in any order you want. It doesn't matter. But each one wrapped by a layer with one of those three names, and it will slot into that space. So anything marked as a reset will slot over here. Anything marked as a component will slot over here. And they'll get sorted into those layers.
Ah, I see the possibilities here. Like you can have, if you have a website that has a news component and a shopping component, you could have the shopping page throw some sort of extra defaults into the
Yeah.
top layer, so
Mhm.
that only when you're loading that page do you get these, but they still sit in the same layer as that, like the
Right.
interface layer, so you can change the overall appearance
Yeah.
without causing problems.
Yeah. Where it gets risky is if you haven't defined all your layers up front, you can end up throwing something in that changes the layer order for other things. And so like you want to be careful about that. I think it should be best practice to declare all your layers up front, so that the order is established, and then add to them from anywhere. And that's also great because say you've got your components split into separate files, which we often do these days. Each of those files can just say that it's part of the component layer, and all of them will get merged together over there. Yeah, you can add to layers from anywhere.
Yeah, it makes so much sense.
Good.
And I feel like that is sort of the underlying thread of a lot of modern CSS. It makes so much sense because I remember, um, way back, like 2012, way back, right? There were websites dedicated just to dealing with CSS inconsistencies and
Yeah.
incongruity. Like, what was it called? There were all
Quirks
these
mode?
websites. Yeah, Quirks mode, which was just like, look, you try to do this thing and it will not work. So here's this insane hack you can apply that will make the browser do what you want in a very illogical way that works around the issues. And now we're more in that layer of, here's the tool that does the thing that you always wanted to do in the way that you would naturally do it. And old people like me are sitting there going, oh, this feels wrong. I feel like there needs to be a hack. Otherwise, it doesn't feel like CSS anymore. It needs to have some sort of very weird workaround to get this obvious thing to work.
Right. And some of that comes from that change in how the specs are written, where they are more focused on making sure that the edge cases are consistent, and that so that browsers aren't having to come up with their own solution to edge cases that weren't spec'd, and coming up with slightly different solutions. And part of that also comes from the browsers. I mean, I think the process has gotten smoother at the working group, and I haven't been there long enough to really talk about how things have changed. But I think browsers used to more often sort of put features out there that hadn't been spec'd yet, and then start fighting over them and try to get some consistency. And that led to less consistency between the browsers. And these days, the browsers are all on board with like, people are going to use our feature more if the other browsers have it. So every browser wants the other browsers to come along. So there really is this built-in collaboration, and things like Interop 2020. Wait, 2022, one of them was called Interop and one of them was called Compat, and I don't remember which one we're in now.
I think it's Interop 2022.
Yeah, Interop 2022, that sounds right. But it's all the browsers
yes,
agreeing
Interop
on
2022.
It's all the browsers agreeing on what new features all of them will implement this year, and consistently. So they're building web platform tests together, and all of them
Which
should
is
have
just
interop on these features by the end of the year.
which is just
Great.
astonishing. It is. I saw that news, and it was one of those, You have to like put your jaw up again because it fell too far down. Where it's one of those things where again, it makes so much sense, but I've made a TikTok about it, and there are literally people in the comments going, "I don't believe it." Like, as in, this is a conspiracy theory? Like, and I'm like, no, it's literally like published on web.dev and it's backed by like the people who wrote the article are the people who would do this. So it's not like if it's a conspiracy of the actual people who do it. So I, it would
Yeah,
actually
and
have, but
to get a sense of
the
the
fact that things are
collaboration.
moving like this is just such it's so the perception of it is so enormous that people have a hard time processing that it's happening.
Yeah, and to get a sense of like how collaborative this is, all of the browsers released their announcement of it within minutes of each other. Like
Mhm.
they're coordinated on this.
Which is just, coming from the ancient browser wars of 10 years ago
Yeah.
is just amazing to see. And it's especially because, if you go back a couple of years, so to when CSS Grid started rolling out, because that
Hmm.
or Flexbox and Grid were the two. I think they were the demarcation line of things are changing in CSS.
Yeah.
Where you saw first Flexbox came out, and Flex came out in a way where it very rapidly started gaining speed in a way that things didn't do before. And I saw in the front end community that adoption started happening at a more rapid rate than other new features previously. Like people were more willing to turn towards this than other things.
Hmm.
And I think part of it was because it solved this impossible set of problems in this super clean way that that just allowed people to do things they always wanted to do that they could never do properly, right? But then when CSS Grid came out, the old pushback came back. This like it's not ready, it's not clear. And I
Hmm.
think part of that was simply that when you lay things out with Grid, you do more stuff. So the impact of it not working in a browser is enormous. Whereas with Flex, it would be like, oh no, my columns don't align. With Grid, it
Uh-huh.
would be like, what is happening on my page? Nothing is where it's supposed to be, right? But once there appeared to establish a pattern here of how these things got rolled out, and I was watching like how Flex rolled out to all the browsers, and it was fairly rapid, and then Grid took a little bit longer because it's way more complex. But then once that pattern had been established, it feels like suddenly all these new features just started clicking in.
Yeah, and I mean, sort of, I think from the browser and CSS Working Group side, the Flexbox rollout felt uh, uncoordinated in a way.
Mhm.
Um, like there were several syntaxes happening. For a while there, people were like trying to support 3 different syntaxes of Flexbox, and it felt like, okay, that didn't quite happen right. So with Grid, there was this sense of like, hold it back until we all have it, and then we'll all roll it out at once, which is basically what happened. It was like within a month,
Mhm.
all the browsers had Grid. It went from
Yeah.
not having Grid to having Grid. And you can see that that's often how things are happening now too. Not always. You know, Firefox has had subgrid now for 3 years or something, and it's finally on Interop 2022, and all the browsers should have it by the end of this year. But so there's some places where somebody gets out ahead, but in a lot of cases now with layers, it rolled out in all 3 major browser engines again within weeks,
Mhm.
uh, which
And
is
that's
happening more and more often.
so, but I think that it kind of speaks to this principle, right? The core web principle of paving the cow paths. That in some cases, I feel like it is necessary for, like, for example, Firefox to say, we're just going to roll out this feature and put it into the world so people can actually use it, right?
Yeah.
Because as you know, it's like if you're working with some of these more cutting edge things, it's like this thing works provided you go to the flags and click on the button, and it
Right.
only works in this browser under certain circumstances, and the spec can change, um, like your other
Like
feature
container
where
queries.
Yeah,
Yeah.
where the actual literal code changes, which can be quite, as a trainer, it can be interesting because I've been monitoring the space for a long time to see, like, at some point we're going to get some sort of element, container, whatever queries that can go into specificity. And I started working on a course, and I was literally sitting there working on like a first look course, assuming like this is like alpha look, things may change at some point, but I felt it was stable. And I'm writing code, and then from one day to the next, my code stopped working.
Yeah.
And I'm like, what happened? And
Yeah.
I was poking around, and I'm like, okay, so what it says on whatever page I found on the CSS Working Group is not matching what it says on the MDN page. So I went in and edited the MDN page. And then when I did, I sent it to the GitHub repo. And then Rachel Andrews like, oh yeah, right. Hold on. Let me just fix this. I think I even asked you on Twitter about it because I was like, why is this not working? And you're like, oh no, we changed that yesterday. And it got rolled out in the browser yesterday. So no one knows that this changed, but all the examples are now bust because
Right.
the property changed names, right?
Yeah, and it's happened a few times with container queries because it's a very powerful feature, and we're trying to finesse this syntax, and it's the reason we released that sort of prototype behind a flag, where hopefully you can't write code in production with that because all your users would have to turn the flag on. That's not likely.
Very
So
realistic scenario, yes.
yeah, so browsers keep it behind a flag so that it's only people doing demos or playing with it can check it out. But it's so that we can get a lot of feedback and make those changes. But then those, I always feel bad. I'm like, I've got 6 people who have made these great demos, and okay, we're going to break them. We're going to break all their demos. If they've made a video, their video is now wrong. But I think the feature is getting better, and we're doing it before it rolls out in a browser so that once it hits the public, it's stable, and we've worked out the kinks.
So can you walk me through this entire process, like step by step, line by line?
Yeah.
Because this starts somewhere. So say take layers. Someone has a conversation at some point and go, we're going to make this feature that does a thing. How does it go from, like, first of all, how does that idea surface to the point where the CSS Working Group says, yes, we're going to do this? And second of all, how does it make its way from problem needs to be solved to it's going live in browsers right now?
Yeah.
You don't have to go to like super deep, but like some sort of overview of this process.
And I think Layers gives a good overview. It's an interesting one because it's maybe the fastest from idea to spec to launch of any spec in a long time. So compare that to, I mean, Layers I proposed at the end of 2019, and we have it in browsers. Compare that to container queries, which were proposed in 2010, and we might get them this year. So like that's a difference in how long it took to solve the problem. But with Layers, the way that an idea gets to the working group is through the CSS Working Group drafts GitHub repo is often where proposals are made and start to get discussed. So CSSWG-drafts is the GitHub. With Layers, I was working with Jen Simmons, then at Mozilla. We were doing a series of videos teaching the cascade. And I was in the middle of working on this video series. And I was like, there's a problem in the cascade, which is that all that we have, yeah, there you go. All that we have to manage what overrides what is this specificity heuristic. A heuristic is like a guess, a guess built into the code. And I was like, all that we have is this guess built into the code, and it doesn't quite match it's pretty good guess, but it doesn't quite do what we want. And so we end up hacking it. We should do something else. And
bang, important.
Yeah, exactly.
Or bang, important.
Or like BEM shortening everything to a single class, or all sorts of different hacks that people use. And I was like, all that we would need here is something that gives us control. And I don't know if that's a way of creating. I mean, I was learning about the origins. There's the browser origin, user agent styles, and then there's a user origin where users can set their preferences, and then there's the author origin. And there's this clever thing where we've got those three origins, and the browser starts at the bottom, and then users are able to override that with preferences, and then we're able to override both. But then if people add the reason important exists is so that users can say, actually, some styles should override authors. Sometimes I need to take charge. And so when they add important, we get 3 new layers, they're flipped. And our two are right next to each other. So we've got our normal and our important right next to each other. And then user important overrides us, and then browser gets final say. So there's this clever sort of like balancing of power in this system.
Right.
And I was working on a course to teach that. And I was like, what if we actually had that internally, not just across the different origins? What if we had that within an origin, we could do the same sort of thing? So that's where the idea for layers came from. I posted, I just mentioned it to Jen. Jen was on the working group and was like, you should post that to CSS Working Group drafts. And I hadn't worked out anything about how this was going to work. I was just like, here's the rough, what if we had origins inside of origins? That's it. And then I was like, or maybe more specificity options, something, I don't know. And people took it from there. And that's how I got invited to the group, is they brought me in to help write that spec.
Right.
And then I got to stick around and help write other specs. So the working group talks about it at a meeting. And I actually wasn't at that first meeting. I think Jen pitched it. But she talked to the group about it, sort of showed what use cases it would solve. That's often the second step. So we'll take a proposal in GitHub, and then somebody will present it to the group and say, what do you think of this idea? And the group will decide if they want to take it up. Doesn't mean it's going to stay the way it was proposed, just like the group, we've agreed we want to work on this, and here's who's going to work on it. So that's the next step. And then somebody will work out a more fleshed out proposal and write up a draft specification and an explainer, sort of like there's different detritus documents you can create to help explain this thing, and then keep bringing it back to the group. And at each step say, does it look like I'm going in the right direction? Do people like where we're going? There will be discussion. People will push back on some things. Once you have a draft of the spec, the group will at some point resolve to accept that as an editor's draft. And the editor's draft is sort of, you can think of it as like PRs in GitHub. It's like, here's the branch we're working in. We'll have a PR into stable. And then stable is a working draft. So at some point we'll say, okay, the editor's draft is far enough along that we want to call it a working draft now. And it goes to that, it gets merged in basically. Once it's a working draft, it's merged into the spec. It's part of the spec. People can start implementing it. So right now, all the 3 main ones that I've been working on are working drafts: cascade, layers, scope, and container queries. You get a first public working draft. There's all sorts of legal processes around making sure there's nothing proprietary in there.
Of course.
And then sort of at each stage, it becomes a little harder to update. Then it's like, once you've got a working draft, in order to make major changes to it, you need the group to sign off on each change. So then you sort of, there's this process of like getting a resolution for each change you want to make. And you work it out in the working draft. And often that's when people will start implementing prototypes. There's no rules about when a browser can do a prototype. they can start a prototype before it even becomes an editor's draft. They can start a prototype later. No rules about that, but often it happens around the time that something is a working draft. Sometimes it happens earlier. And then once the working draft is feeling fairly stable and has very few issues remaining, people will start talking about launching. And once the feature is supported in several browsers and fairly stable, it will move to candidate recommendation, is sort of means it's done.
Yeah.
And we're barely going to touch it from here on. And that's the process, more or less.
Yeah. So,
but it's a lot of phone calls and discussions and issues, and
it's complicated. I think that this is the thing that the more I dive into these things, like I've had this cursory understanding of how CSS is built for many years because, I've been casually following developments of certain features. But the more I dig into it, the more I realize just how complex it is, because there is this point in the process where it all becomes mission critical. And when I say mission critical, I mean, like, if the implementation isn't done right, the negative impact on the browser and on the web is huge. And you get all these weird considerations, like, or not weird, but like all these considerations you don't think about, like, what does it do to performance in the browser? Does the browser now use more electricity than it did before? Does it use more processing power than it did? Like, there's this constant complaint people have about Chrome eats all your resources, right? And I remember early on in CSS Grid would like significantly slow down your browser because it was so compute intensive. And all these little tweaks are huge computing things that are happening in the browser. So there's, at some point, I can see how like a browser vendor would go in and say, we need to rewrite our whole stack to make this work. Which is probably why things like subgrid take a long time, because subgrid requires this repainting within the context that is beyond what grid is doing, with relational connections between pieces that don't connect. And the same with container queries. There are things happening at rendering points within the stack that previously were considered nothing happens down here. And then all of a sudden, no, now it does. We have to re-render everything from the top again.
Yeah, and there's a very specific restriction built in for performance. CSS is required to run at 60 frames per second. And so
more processing power, bigger computers.
Like, we can't do things that would make things run slower than 60 frames per second. That's the rule. And I was really worried when I was coming into the group. I felt like, well, I don't know everything about how browser engines work, and so I was scared that I was unqualified for this. And then I got there and I realized, well, that's why there's 60 of us or whatever.
There are other people who know this.
Yeah, somebody else will know that part, and I'll know my part, and we'll work together. That's how you do it. So, but it is true. Like, the reason Chrome doesn't have subgrid yet is because in order to build subgrid, Chrome rewrote their entire layout engine. So yeah, coming soon. But it took a full rewrite of the engine to make some of these things possible.
Okay, so there's a related question coming in here. So let's see, blah, 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 blah. How is it ensured that the implementation of the working group feature is consistent across browsers, and that the browser devs do not take liberty at tweaking the proposed features? That's a solid question.
Yeah, I mean, in one sense, the browser devs are involved in the working group, and so they do bring their opinions and they do change it along the way. So the browser devs have some leeway to contribute back ideas and concerns about the specs. So specs will change once people start implementing them, because the implementers will go like, okay, that sounds cool, but it doesn't actually work. So they will make changes, but then the way that it stays consistent is the web platform tests. You can go to wpt.fyi. I think that's the one.
Let's see. Results.
Yeah.
Web platform. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, there's also wpt.live if you want to actually click through all the tests yourself and see them load in your browser. Those are the web platform tests. And as the developers, I mean, sometimes the spec writers will build some tests, some web platform tests, and often also as the browsers are implementing, the browser developers will add a test for everything that they do. And then a different browser will come along and be like, okay, but you missed this edge case, and that browser will add a new test to cover an edge case. And so these tests just keep growing as we find additional edge cases that need testing and need interoperability. And that's how they keep it consistent, is by watching how many of these tests pass, how many of these tests fail, and trying to all get the test passing.
I guess there's like this question hints at what I was talking about earlier, that there's this historical feeling of there being a browser war, right? That the browsers are like intentionally implementing things before others. And I have to say, at times it still looks like there is, because the browsers will try to one up each other by releasing features sooner, but then sooner becomes like a week before the other browsers, which isn't really much of a competitive advantage. But I can say from my perspective, watching this very, very closely, what I'm seeing is the browser war has shifted from I'm going to implement a feature that no one else has, which is what like the IE versus Netscape war was about, to the feature works better, faster, stronger in my browser than in your browser, right?
Yeah.
Or the
dev
crazy one is
tooling is
that
better.
dev tooling is better,
Yeah.
which is like, yes, this is super relevant for normal people who are not web developers, but there's become this the battleground has shifted into a space that is less doesn't negatively impact the end user, right? It is more of a feature forward type battle than it is I'm going to one up you and like screw you out of customers thing, which is very interesting. And also this idea that the browsers are actually working together to move the web forward because it benefits everyone is this. It'll take time for people to process, but that seems to be what is happening.
Yeah, well, and I think there is a new sort of economic pressure on that, right? That like when I got started, we weren't the tech industry. I was just a web master or something, web developer. Like there wasn't an industry that I was getting into. I was just building websites. And at that point, there is a little bit more freedom for the browsers as well. And at this point, like the browser is like, well, I want Home Depot to use my thing. I want Nike to use my thing, right? And they're only going to use this. These companies are only going to use the new feature if it's supported in all the browsers, because they're not going to want to lose customers because the thing didn't work. And so that economic pressure is just different now. The browsers want all the other browsers to do the same thing so that Nike will use their feature or whatever. And that's good for us. That it gets them all on the same page. And I mean, they do still sometimes have different priorities or different sense of what users should have. But more often now, those fights are happening behind the scenes in the working group, arguing over what makes it into the spec in the first place, or which specs we should be focusing on. So the tension is more behind the scenes now when there is tension, but it is a very collaborative process. We're all in the same meetings together. The working group meetings are people from Apple and people from Adobe and people from Google and Microsoft and so on and so on.
Yeah, it's when many years ago, the web standards group were like, our work is done, we're quitting. And I remember at the time I was like, what? Are you crazy? This seems premature to me to just like, things kind of work, that's enough. We don't right. But now, 10 years later, I'm like, yeah, it was accurate. That it did like the task that they had set forth, which was to get the browsers to collaborate instead of
Mhm.
fight, was actually completed. It just needed a lot of time to
Yeah.
percolate into what it is today. And it's, you know, if we step outside of CSS for a second and look at other things, the thing that used to happen, which was a browser would roll out a feature and try to outcompete the others, it does still happen, but in a very different way. Like I can think of, like, Google tends to do this. Like, they'll roll out lazy loading as a feature, right? Like
Mhm.
platform level lazy loading, and be like, that is now a thing that we do. And then everyone else is like, it is? Okay, I guess either we do it your way or we start a war. And then they, you know, eventually the other ones will
Right.
usually either jump on whatever's released if it's something like that, or they'll be like, actually, we're going to put out a competing feature right now. But
Right.
I sure hope we don't get like the WCRG, like two completely separate specs warring it out in public, and then someone like hijacking an open source project just to like force feed one version into the web. That type of thing, I think, is gone. I hope is gone
I hope
because of
so
the
too.
proliferation.
Yeah.
Because watching that from the back end was like, I feel like this is not the right way to go about this problem solving. So seeing, you know, I'm so happy to be alive in this environment. And I'm so happy to onboard new web developers now, where I don't have to spend hours telling them about how to hack the web to get it to work. And how I can be like, all that garbage that I'm carrying around with me, you don't have to know about. Like, we'll just not talk about it because it's gone. And
Yeah, yeah.
there
Double
seems to
margin
be a
hack. You don't still teach the double margin hack?
there's so many things where like it's more the other way around. I will be like, oh look, I'm gonna do this thing, and then I start, and I'm like, nope, there's a tool for this. I don't have to do any of
Yeah.
this. Like when you start nesting your divs, no, 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 no.
Yeah.
No, just markup. I can put proper layout tools in place here, and I think it'll be interesting to see. I'm very curious. We should have this conversation again in like 2 years,
Mhm.
revisit this exact conversation and talk about how layers has rolled out.
Mhm.
Because what I'm curious to see is there appears to be um, a kind of boomerang effect happening in how CSS is used, right? So we had write CSS proper and then minify it and then push it to the
Mhm.
web. And then we got all these tools that would like, no, tear the CSS apart to make it more efficient inside these front
Mhm.
end tools, the front end frameworks, and output some, you know, computer generated hash stuff that is unreadable to make it faster. And then it feels like the CSS platform is kind of pushing back against that and saying, actually, no, let's do the right proper CSS thing and just make it work the same way and make it
Yeah.
work as fast. And it'll be very interesting to see if the community that has now wholesale adopted this, I'm going to give it to the computer and the computer is going to pick my
Right.
code apart, is willing to go, oh, we don't have to do that. We can just do it in a cleaner way and make it human readable again. Or if machine the machine barf methodology has become so established that it doesn't go away.
Yeah, and I think the answer might be mixed, right? Sort of
Yeah.
in the same way that you see like there's a big move towards single page apps, and then there's a pushback against that with static site generators. But really, both of them are moving towards some middle ground
Mhm.
where we get advantages from both approaches, but we try to spec it and make it part of the web, not extra tooling around it. And um, I think that's the same thing. That's the same way we're thinking, and it's a to me it seems like a healthy process, right? For people to go off and be like, well, actually I want CSS to be more powerful, I'm going to start building these tools around it. And then for the working group to go, cool, we can improve on that by putting it in the browser.
Yeah.
And here's the changes that we'll have to make to do that. Like variables came from, the idea comes from SAS, but the result
Yeah.
looks very different because they're very different languages. SAS is server-side compiled and CSS is not. It runs in the browser. So we get a very different feature, but it's inspired by and there's sort of that continual pushing back and forth between the tooling what is in the platform. And I think that's great. And it will be interesting to see. I mean, I think it's also going to be different for different features. So cascade layers are really invasive. Like you have to use them properly. You want to start like wrapping all of your code in these layer rules, which is great, but it's hard to polyfill or do a little bit at a time and have progressive enhancement, right? Because we're changing something that's so fundamental at the core of the language. And so I think, like, I'm glad we rolled it out. I think it's going to be slow for people to pick it up because it's so impactful. You can't just count on it falling back gracefully or something.
Yeah.
And that's going to be different for container queries. Container queries are much easier to just sort of, I can, if a browser doesn't support this, I can fall back to a media query. It's not ideal, but it works fine. So different features are going to have different abilities to ramp up quickly. So it might be that even though container queries roll out later, they get picked up sooner. We'll see.
And you're on to the next thing before that even happens, right? You're going to be, what's the next thing?
Well,
give us the goods.
We have I think scope is the next of the three that I was primarily working on last year. And scope is still a little bit more nebulous. We're still sort of exploring that space. Nobody's built a prototype yet. I think we might see a prototype later this year. And then again, similar to container queries, things will probably change in the prototype before we're actually ready to launch. So scope right now, for me, it's like, I've done my work to get that started. There's going to be some ongoing work as prototypes start happening to finesse it and get it solidified. So that's in my ongoing column, but still not released. And then, we're looking at things like scroll linked animations and other animation features, other scrolling features. CSS toggles is an idea we're talking about a lot, but it's hard to know exactly. The idea is there are some things that we want to be able to take user input that's style specific, say sliding drawers, like an off-canvas layout. That toggle, why can't I just do that in CSS, that open and close this drawer? Or change the color mode from light mode to dark mode to auto from your operating system. Tabs and accordions, those are sort of presentational toggles. Should we be able to do those from CSS? If we do those from CSS, can we bake in the accessibility so that authors aren't having to rebuild these components from scratch and reinvent and go figure out how to apply all the proper ARIA roles, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Like we don't want users to have to do that. We would rather browsers can do that for you and get the accessibility right. Still lots of open questions there. It's not clear, can we do it 60 frames a second? Can we do it accessible? Like, if we can't release this. But that's one that we're exploring. That could be pretty cool, or it could not work at all.
Yeah, exactly.
We'll see.
As with everything else on the web.
Yeah.
I have this drawing. It could be very cool, or it could not work at all. Let's see.
There was a moment with container queries where, like, we thought we had it. I was giving presentations on it. And then there was a moment where we were like, oh, there's a problem, a fundamental problem that hasn't been solved that could tank the whole project. And I had a very rough July panicking about maybe this whole feature I've been giving talks about is going to tank. But it didn't. We made it through. We found a solution. We think it's working. But it was weird to be like, you really can be close in a way, where you have a working prototype, but also it's impossible to spec the details. Like it's possible to have something where it's both working in a browser and it's impossible to spec, and you still can't launch it. then, because if you can't assure that all the browsers will do the same thing, it's not ready to ship.
Yeah, that's, I can
Which is
see
weird.
that. Yeah, I can see that. That's like the multi-vendor problem, right?
Yeah.
So, okay, Miriam, this was fantastic. So insightful. I think everyone who watched this now or will watch this in the future will get a much more in-depth understanding of all the things that are going on that are making CSS possible. And I think everyone here is going to go, let's look a bit about this layer thing and see how I can implement it. I'm super excited.
And if you're interested in the process at all, I mean, everything is public on that CSS Working Group drafts. So go there, leave proposals, check out the issues, see what's being discussed, contribute your ideas. It's all in the open, and even when we have meetings that are not open to the public, but then the transcripts get posted to the issues, so it all ends up public, and you can comment on what's happening. Get involved.
I had this awesome experience a couple of weeks ago where I was sitting playing around with CSS with subgrid, and I was like, why is it that I can't define a fallback for the subgrid so that if there is no parent grid, then automatically fall back to an internally defined grid? And I was like, you know what? I'm going to leave this as a comment on the CSS draft to see. And then a few weeks later, I got a thing in my inbox that said, like, this was addressed in the working group meeting and is moving forward. And I'm like, see, and I'm like, Mom.
Yeah, that's how it works.
And it's funny because, you know, for normal people, it feels like this nebulous process, but in reality, it's just normal people working on this stuff, right? Who are really passionate about it. And the web is driven forward by its users. So input actually makes a difference. And I tell people all the time, but I have to remind myself that that's actually the case.
And you don't need to come with solutions. It's fine. You can just list problems, and then the working group will talk about them and see if we can help come up with solutions. And we'll bring that back to you and see if the solution works for you. And yeah, it's a very open process. I really encourage people to get involved. It can be overwhelming. There's a lot of issues on that board. It's a very
you have to be specific about what you're searching for.
Yeah, but it's open. Yeah, you can find what you're interested in and file your issues.
All right. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you very much for everyone who watched and left comments. I'll jump into the comments later and leave things. I'll also add all the links from the thing today to the description afterwards, so you can go and look at all these things. And until next time, thank you all, and have a great rest of the day.
See ya.